Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Who Pays and Who Benefits? How to Incorporate Equity in Utility Resource Planning. My name is Cyrus Bedwar, Director of Energy Efficiency Policy for the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, and I'm going to be your host this morning. Before we get into our content, a few notes. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. If you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box and our panelists will respond after the presentation. Following the webinar, we'll be sending out the recording, slide deck, and resources to everybody who registered. You'll also receive a follow-up survey to provide feedback on our webinar. We hope you're familiar with SEIA and the work we do, but as a reminder, SEIA promotes efficient energy as a catalyst for economic growth, workforce development, and energy security across 11 southeastern states. We provide a wide range of services, including research, consultation and education, stakeholder facilitation, program management, and financial services to a diverse set of stakeholders in the energy sector. The policy team at SEIA is also putting the finishing touches on the last 3 of our state guides to utility energy efficiency. These reports describe the regulatory system that governs energy efficiency in each state the SEIA serves. They're designed to help stakeholders better understand and, if desired, engage in the regulatory processes that govern energy efficiency throughout the region. You can visit SEIAalliance.org/state utility guides to find all of them. And while most of us are happy to have election season behind us, I'll mention that SEIA has released its 2022 election highlights covering the results of elections of interest for the region. You can find it at SEIAalliance.org/blog. And I'd like to recognize SEIA's program associate, Lily Smith, for her work on both the state utility guides and the election highlights. Today's webinar is the 5th in our series about the National Standard Practice Manual. First published in 2017 and re-released as the National Standard Practice Manual for Benefit Cost Analysis of Distributed Energy Resources in 2020, the NSPM provides a comprehensive framework for cost-effectiveness assessment of DERs. It is intended for use by jurisdictions to help inform which resources to acquire to meet their specific policy goals and objectives. And I'd like to pause for a moment and thank Julie Michaels and E for the Future for their support of this work. Our past webinars in this series have provided an overview of the manual, as well as specific case studies focusing on both energy efficiency and electric vehicles. Today, we'll explore how the authors of the NSPM are considering addressing equity in the context of benefit cost analysis. For SEIA, one of the primary ways we approach equity in the energy arena is through the issue of energy insecurity. To walk us through that issue, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Will Bryan, SEIA's Director of Research, to share more about the concept of energy insecurity and how it manifests in the region. Will has built SEIA's research practice and played a leadership role in developing our perspective on energy insecurity and the role energy efficiency can play in addressing it. Following that, Kanitcha Barnes from Duke Energy will share the story of the Low Income Affordability Collaborative, a forum convened in North Carolina to help stakeholders work through equity issues facing Duke's customers. In her role as Duke Energy's Energy Policy Management Director, Kanitcha played a leading role in the collaborative. More broadly, she's responsible for supporting the development of energy policy for Duke Energy in North Carolina. Finally, we'll be joined by Alice Napoleon of Synapse Energy Economics, who will discuss the concept of distributional equity analysis. Alice is a principal associate at Synapse, where she conducts technical and economic analysis of energy and environmental issues regarding energy efficiency, energy justice, alternative regulatory mechanisms, and the future of fossil gas. Oh, sorry. With that, I'll turn it over to Will to kick us off.
Thank you, Cyrus. Here we go. Well, it's great to be with y'all today. Really excited to get to talk about our work on energy and security, and I'm hopeful that this can provide some context for the discussion that we're going to be having about the NSPM and ways to really address some of the inequities that we're talking about today and that we see throughout our region. Our work on energy and security really has been ongoing for years now. It got a lot of momentum during the pandemic when we began to see high levels of utility shutoffs and people struggling to afford their bills at a rate that really we haven't seen before. As we were thinking about what impact that had, I think energy efficiency came to the fore in a lot of those discussions. And so, a lot of the work that we're doing these days is focused on how can we leverage energy efficiency as a tool to address, the most energy insecure households across the Southeast. And so what I'm going to do today is really just provide some context for the discussion that I'm excited to have, about the NSPM and other approaches to addressing energy and security from a regulatory and programmatic standpoint throughout our region. And so I thought I would start really by kind of addressing maybe the elephant in the room, and that's the fact that the Southeast has, one of the highest rates of energy insecurity in the country. In part, this is we can see this through the bills that people are paying. Our region has some of the lowest electric rates in the contiguous United States, but it has some of the highest residential electric bills. And so if you look at this map here, you can see that the East, South Central, and South Atlantic census divisions have some of the lowest electric rates at about 11 and 12 cents per kilowatt hour. But average monthly bills are $131 and $138 a month, which really is second and third only to the Pacific non-contiguous states, Alaska and Hawaii. And so I think there are a lot of reasons for this. I think high cooling costs are one, but I think they speak to some deeper infrastructural issues that really place residents of the Southeast at a higher risk of energy insecurity than people living in almost any other part of the country. And that's really what I want to kind of shed light on today. These high bills disproportionately impact two communities in our region. One is low-income households, and the other is people of color. This is a chart that shows average annual energy costs by household for people of different income brackets. So at the bottom, you can see 0 to 30%, 30 to 60%, 60 to 80, 80 to 100, and 100% plus. And that is as a percentage of area median income. So on the far left, if you're in that 0 to 30% category, you're in the lowest income bracket. And on the far right, if you're in that 100% plus category, you're in the highest income bracket in the region. And this is for the Southeast as a whole, and you can see the costs broken down by electric, gas, and other fuel. I think the striking thing for me in this chart is just that it's pretty static, no matter what your income is. So between the lowest and highest earners in our region, the difference is about $29 a month for their average bill. And so, when we're thinking about the difference in income between those groups, we're talking more than $40,000 at a minimum. And so, what that means is that people at the lower end of the income spectrum are paying a much bigger proportion of their income to keep the lights on and keep the power on than people at that higher end. And so the burden really falls more heavily on those communities. And as we're going to see in just a few minutes, people of color as well, regardless of income, face energy insecurity at higher rates than others. And so what this equates to is really the fact that 1 out of every 3 people in the South faces energy insecurity, which we define as an inability to adequately meet household basic energy needs. So, an inability to keep the heat, the cooling, the lighting on. Energy is a part of everyday life. And if you struggle to maintain that energy, then you are energy insecure. There are a lot of elements to this, and I'm not going to touch on them in much depth. But I think there are a lot of pieces that go into making a household energy insecure. One is economic, your income. Do you have enough money to cover your bills and all your other expenses? Another is physical, kind of the physical infrastructure that you live in. Your house, how efficient is it? How expensive is it to maintain, a moderate level of energy services in that residence? For some, households, it's much more expensive than for others that are more efficient. And then finally, behavior plays a key role in how people, adapt to energy insecurity, and it can place people at a higher risk for health and safety issues. So for instance, if you perhaps heat your home with an oven to try to cut down on your energy costs, that puts you and everyone in your home at a higher risk of health and safety hazards. And so, kind of coping with energy insecurity can both reduce expenses, but it can also, lead to other costs in other areas as well. All of that, I think, rolls into energy security. And it's important to note, this is not something that just kind of emerged out of nowhere. This energy insecurity has a history, a really important history. And I think it's one that we need to acknowledge and understand if we're going to really begin to solve it at scale throughout our region. I think that the histories of energy and housing are particularly intertwined when it comes to energy insecurity. Communities throughout our region and really throughout the nation have faced wildly disparate, abilities to get access to healthy, efficient housing that would both reduce costs and improve the health of occupants for generations. And, this is rooted in racist housing policies that reach back into the late 19th and early 20th century, really with segregation. It's also rooted in discriminatory policies and practices that have continued for decades after that. So one example of that is kind of the process of housing segregation and redlining, which, for generations has denied people of color access to housing at the same rate, has denied kind of housing choice to people of color, and has prevented them from getting access to capital that could be used to make homes more efficient, and to kind of improve the premises. And so, one way to see that is through these redlining maps that were created around the turn of the century by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal agency that guided mortgage lending practices throughout the country. They created a series of maps to do that, where they coded neighborhoods in major American cities as either risky for investment, seen in the map as red and yellow, or safe for mortgage investment, seen in the map in blue and green. These maps were largely created on the basis of race. So neighborhoods that were deemed risky were largely, neighborhoods where there were high proportions of people of color, whereas neighborhoods that were deemed safe for mortgage investment were neighborhoods that were predominantly white. And I think the important thing is that this kind of series of policies and practices really impacted people's ability to choose where they live, to invest in their housing, and actually to buy housing for generations, even after the New Deal era when these maps were created. One way to see that is just to overlay energy burden data on top of this map. So this is energy cost as a percentage of your income today. And I should note, this is Birmingham, Alabama, one of the cities that CS serves. The darker red areas are where, on average, households face energy costs that are 15% of their income or more. And you can see they largely track with redlined neighborhoods, whereas neighborhoods that were predominantly white, that were rated A or B, kind of down in the south end of the city, have energy costs that are 0 to 6% of their annual income, which would be considered affordable. So, these kind of policies and practices, I think, are really correspond to the energy insecurity that we see today throughout the region. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that these are practices rooted in segregation and racial discriminatory practices that reach back generations. Energy insecurity, like I said, is very common in the South even before COVID-19. The dark blue pie chunk is the South, and this gives you kind of a sense of how many households in our region face different aspects of energy insecurity. So about 4.6 million households in our region have to keep their home in an unhealthy temperature because of the cost of energy. Almost 11 million households have had to reduce their consumption of food or medicine to pay their energy bills. 5.7 million households in our region have either received stop service notifications or been disconnected. And then 5.3 million households in our region are just unable to use their heating and cooling equipment. And just to give you a sense of kind of the proportion of households in each state that face energy insecurity, I mean, you can see the South stands out here in red because a much higher proportion of households overall in these states face energy insecurity than any other part of the country. So you can see, it ranges really from 27% in North Carolina and Tennessee, which is kind of on the lower end of the spectrum, to almost 36%, and then 41% in Mississippi. So we're approaching half of households in Mississippi face energy insecurity and are uncertain whether they're going to be able to pay their energy bills from month to month. And so I think if we're looking at this as a regional problem, this map demonstrates that it really is, and that households in our region are particularly struggling with energy insecurity. Part of this is rooted in the housing that people live in. I think one way to think of this is kind of the age of housing. The South as a whole has younger housing, if we want to call it that, than other parts of the country. The housing stock here is largely newer than many other parts of the country, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's efficient or that it's affordable. If you look at this map of the region, this shows kind of the median year when households or housing units were built, with kind of blue shades indicating newer housing and red shades indicating older housing. So it's largely built since the 1970s in our region, but still 53% of all homes in our region were built before there was any energy code on the books, before there was any minimum standard for energy efficiency. And so I think we're really kind of reaping the benefits, maybe not the benefits, the drawbacks of that today in the fact that our region really struggles with energy insecurity. And when you layer in things like the proportion of the population living in mobile homes, which are up to 50% more inefficient than a typical single family home, then I think we're really seeing how housing kind of is at the root of a lot of the issues that we see. And I want to stress, I mentioned this kind of at the outset, but I want to stress that energy insecurity really is not just about your income. It's not just something that impacts low income households in our region. It also impacts people of color regardless of income. Research has shown that communities of color face energy insecurity at higher rates than other households, than other white households across the nation, but especially in the South. And again, that's a product of generations of housing segregation, a lack of access to affordable capital, and other kind of prejudicial programs and policies. But I think one way to see that is in this map of the city of Atlanta. Here we've calculated the average energy cost per square foot by neighborhood, with lighter shades of red being lower costs and darker shades of red being higher costs per square foot. If you know the geography of Atlanta, you know that this roughly corresponds to the racial makeup of the neighborhood, with neighborhoods in the south and west parts of Atlanta being more predominantly Black neighborhoods, whereas neighborhoods in kind of the north and east parts of the city are predominantly white. And just to kind of underline this, if you live in Buckhead, which is that neighborhood kind of in the top northernmost district, you pay 4 times less per square foot for your energy in your home than if you live in Bankhead, which is that kind of darkest red part to the east of downtown Atlanta, or to the west, excuse me, of downtown Atlanta. This is regardless of income. And so, what this means is that, predominantly Black neighborhoods are at a disadvantage when it comes to paying the bills, because they're having to pay more just to keep the same level of service than predominantly white neighborhoods in Atlanta. And I think that we found that is true for many other parts of our region as well. I think it's also important to highlight the fact that health and efficiency go hand in hand. Unaffordable homes are not just a financial drain, they're also, unhealthy. There's a lot of research showing that if you live in an inefficient home, it puts you at a greater risk for things like asthma, or, making it more difficult to control your asthma attacks. And this is especially true of children living in those homes, because there's a greater likelihood of asthma triggers like mold and moisture and pests and things like that. And so here you can see this is a map of energy use per square foot overlaid on top of pediatric asthma emergency room visits. And you can see, again, this kind of dual geography in Atlanta exists, where if you live in the kind of northern or eastern neighborhoods in the city, which are predominantly white, you face relatively low energy costs and relatively low rates of pediatric asthma visits to the ER. Whereas if you live in the south and west parts of the city, it's flipped. You have high energy costs in your home because they're largely, inefficient. And then you also have, kind of high corresponding rates of ER visits for kids living in those neighborhoods. So, I think it's important as we're thinking about why energy equity matters to know that, it's not just about affordability for people living in inefficient homes. It's about health and safety as well. And resilience, to add one more layer on top of that. Energy insecure households are really kind of the first to be vulnerable to extreme weather and other disaster events, which are becoming more common in this era of a changing climate. Again, this is some maps that SIA has developed for the city of Atlanta. You can see the map on the left is an urban heat island map of the city. And the map on the right is a map of tree canopy in the city. And basically, you can see they're pretty much the inverse of each other. Areas with a lot of trees don't have a lot of heat. Areas with a lot of heat, don't have a lot of trees. And again, the research shows that communities of color and low-income communities, not just in Atlanta, but throughout our region, face up to 7 degrees Fahrenheit more when it comes to cooling their homes than neighborhoods that are predominantly white that have lots of green space and tree canopy. So, we're saying if you're low income or a person of color, you're really starting out at a disadvantage because you're having to cool your home more in times of extreme heat than someone maybe who lives just a mile away in a predominantly white neighborhood that has a much higher proportion of tree canopy and green space. And so I think, again, we need to kind of think about energy efficiency more broadly and think about some of the ways that kind of the house is the locus of solving energy efficiency issues, both inside and outside. And that really brings me to my last point, and that, is if we really want to truly address energy inequities and energy insecurity at scale, we need to view housing as infrastructure. And this is really stealing a phrase from U.S. Department of Energy's Tony Reams. We need to think of housing as infrastructure, housing as the grid, and we need to invest accordingly. And I think today's webinar is going to help us think about some regulatory and programmatic solutions to that. But here are just a couple of ways on this slide to really kind of understand the ways that housing truly is infrastructure and kind of requires investments that prioritize it in that way. So for instance, rooftop solar can decrease expenditures and emissions. Weatherization improves energy performance and reduces health hazards in the home. Expanding green space and decreasing impervious surfaces reduces air temperature and flooding. And then EV access and charging can provide backup power, promoting resilience, and then reducing auto emissions that fall most heavily on vulnerable communities throughout the nation. And so, ultimately, I think this is kind of one way of understanding both the need and, kind of how we can begin to conceptualize the problem in ways that direct investments and direct kind of policies and programs in ways that are going to reduce people's exposure to energy insecurity and reduce people's vulnerability to energy insecurity at scale. And so just to wrap up, I'll say, these are topics that SIA has been thinking a lot about. We have produced a number of different resources. You can see a couple of those here that I just want to flag. One is a story map, an interactive story map that we produced a few years ago that kind of tells the story of energy insecurity in the South. It uses data in an interactive way to kind of lay out, what is the problem that we're trying to solve in our region, and then, to think about some of the potential solutions. We've also developed something called the Energy Equity Inspector, which is a geospatial tool, which kind of brings together a lot of different data sources to understand where communities are at risk for energy insecurity, both from an affordability, a health, emissions, and more types of data, standpoint. And then we've produced something called the Energy Equity Action Planner to kind of understand who needs to be engaged in conversations about how we solve energy insecurity. And then finally, I'll just put in a kind of a flag for an initiative that SIA has recently taken over from Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, the Southeast Energy Insecurity Project, where we are kind of using this as an umbrella for a lot of our energy insecurity work. And we're using it as a regional coordinating entity to address energy insecurity kind of across the 11 states that SIA serves. You can see sort of the approach that we're taking in the final report from the Duke initiative, which is available at this link here. And you'll hear much more about that, I think, in the coming days. But with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it over to Cyrus and Kanisha.
Thanks so much. So you just heard why we think energy security is an important equity issue. Next, as she pulls her slides up, we're going to hear from Kenitcha Barnes of Duke Energy about how one utility, their commission, and their stakeholders are beginning to address energy equity and energy insecurity issues. Duke Energy requested that the North Carolina Utilities Commission convene the Low Income Affordability Collaborative. And that process ran through about 12 months in which stakeholders came together and discussed issues of affordability and potential solutions. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Kenitcha Barnes to share that story. Thanks so much, Kenitcha.
Thank you, Cyrus. Can you hear me?
We can, loud and clear.
All right. Lighting doesn't look the best, so I apologize for that here. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you again. So I appreciate the opportunity to share information about the Low Income Affordability Collaborative that Duke jointly led with the North Carolina Public Staff. As Cyrus mentioned, this is a collaborative that the company proactively requested that the commission approve in 2019 in both our Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress rate cases. And we were pleased when the commission issued the order that they issued the order approving the Low Income Collaborative, along with approximately around 30 prescriptive tasks, or I'll say areas of focus for the collaborative. So I just want to take some time to walk through and give you all an update about that. What I will share is that, like I said, we talk about the time frame, and we think about what's happening today with the energy transition, economically, what's going on in the economy. And so this right here, I just think is very timely in the work that we're doing. So, great, save it in progress. And so, you know, one of the things I would talk about is the company is very committed to identifying and understanding what are some of the challenges that are leading to some affordability challenges for our customers. Our commitment is really related to and deeply rooted in our commitment for affordable, reliable, and increasingly clean energy for to our customers. We recognize, and some of this is based on some of the information that you hear that Will just spoke about but we recognize that there are challenges that customers are experiencing. We also recognize that those challenges, some of them are deeper than, of course, what the utility is able to directly influence, but we are committed to saying, okay, from the electric side and the work that we do and on behalf of our customers, what can we do? With that, you know, as we look at and we're moving into this energy transition, unlike something that the industry has ever faced, we recognize that there is going to take investment to support one of the most impactful transitions of our history of the industry. And with that, the collaborative has looked at a number of things. And what I'd like to share is some of the things how we're talking about it with Duke, from framing up conversations with stakeholders around what are some of the short-term and long-term solutions to assist customers with affordability challenges, specifically to their electric usage. All right. So like I said, Cyrus mentioned the Low Income Collaborative. So let me just give you a little bit of information just to share foundationally how the collaborative came to be and members of the collaborative. With one of the requirements that the commission put in their order approving the collaborative was that the company needed to hear from interested stakeholders who wanted to be a part of the collaborative. This slide right here just provides a few of the logos of some of the members of the collaborative that were represented. And so what you'll see is you see ARP, you see Dominion Energy, who's that's another utility that has service and has customers within North Carolina. You see a number of government agencies, a number of nonprofits. And just when looking at the list, some of these organizations have varying missions and areas of focus. But one of the things that was consistent is they all were committed to joining the collaborative, having discussions and understanding what are some of the challenges, and also helping to solutionize some of the opportunities we have to address energy affordability for our customers in North Carolina. And one of the things that I'll highlight is with the varying number of organizations that were part of the collaborative, I'm sure that, it goes without saying that different organizations thought we should do things differently. As when I say we, I mean the collaborative had difference of opinions. And so through the 12 months, I would just share that I think we all, but I'll say mainly from a Duke perspective, had the opportunity to listen, lean in, and learn, and really come up with, out of all that we were looking at, what are some areas of focus that we really wanted to hone in on, and I'll talk about some of that a little bit later. But the core basis, though, too, of the collaborative was what is information that we can look at, that we can analyze? What is the data that we have available to help us understand what are some of the challenges that our customers are experiencing? And so we were committed to have what I would describe as data-driven decisions. And so with that, as part of the collaborative and part of the work that Duke was doing is we had a group of individuals that were around looking at data and analysis. And so that group right there was really committed to saying, okay, let's look at data, see what customers are experiencing, and that right there will help inform the decisions that we are looking at, or the recommendations, and mainly also the discussions of collaborative members. So just so that kind of give you a little bit breakdown of how the collaborative was divided and conquered their work. Like I said, we had approximately over around 30 tasks that we had to do. We recognized that we had a 12-month process, and so everybody couldn't lean into all the work. We divided the work streams up into 4 sub-teams, and those 4 sub-teams had specific work that they were able to, that they were responsible for leading. They had a number of working meetings, and so over the year process, we probably had over 50 sub-team meetings. And then we had about 9 core low-income collaborative meetings where those sub-teams came back, reported back, had discussions with the broader collaborative members to make sure that everybody understood and knew what was going on, and we could solicit the impact of others. And so each sub-team had 2 co-leads. And so for out of the 8 co-leads that were there, they represented Duke. They also represented some folks from individuals from government agencies, along with nonprofits. So not only was the collaborative very diverse in the membership structure, so were the co-leads that were leading the 4 sub-teams. All right. So one of the things I talked about was the data. So what we did was we looked at customer accounts that qualified. They were DEP, Duke Energy Progress, and Duke Energy Carolinas residential customers that had active service with the company and met a number of other eligibility requirements. These were customers that had electric service that was active and met the eligibility requirements from March of 2019 through February 2020. Included in the analysis was around about 2.5 million customers. And so we looked at the data and analyzed the data as a collaborative from a number of different spectrums, different views. One of those views was homeowners versus renters, multifamily versus single family. Some of the same characteristics that we heard Will mention as it relates to ethnicity. We also looked at it by the age of the customer, fuel source. And so that gave us a lot of information on these customers. And that right there informed some of the couple points that I wanted to touch on today. And so we too looked at energy intensity. And so what this top graph here shows you is how we look at customers by income brackets and then also other data points. So the commission had required that the collaborative look at customers who are below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines and below 150% of the federal poverty guidelines. And so similar to most utilities, income is not a requirement for customers when they're applying for electric service with the utility. And so we don't have income data directly from customers. We don't have a number of the data points directly from customers that the commission requested that we look at the information from. So we use the third-party data source. We use Axiom as our third-party data source to get information that we didn't have directly coming in from the customer or a third party. And so when you look here and you see customers below 200%, 150 to 200%, or below 150%, those data points from light blue to dark blue were all sources from Axiom third party. You do also see here this yellow bar. The yellow bar represents customers who receive LIHEAP or SIP assistance, low-income energy assistance program, or crisis intervention program. Those are two programs that are funded by federal dollars to North Carolina Department of Social Service. North Carolina Department of Social Health, North Carolina DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, And so we had a legal agreement with DHHS that allowed us through COVID to understand who was a LIHEAP and SIP recipients. And we then, during that time frame, made sure that they were protected from non-pay disconnect. And we went into another agreement with them during the time frame of the low income collaborative to use that data to include in the analysis. So that's the yellow bar. So one thing that's different from the blue bars in comparison to the yellow bars is the yellow bars are customers who have been directly qualified based on income. And we know that because they went through their local agency for LIHEAP and SIP assistance versus the Axiom data, like I said, that's purchase data. And so honing in on what the information shows. The purple line here shows that the average kilowatt hours per square foot for the North Carolina customers included in this analysis was 0.81 kWh per square foot. So as you look at that purple line in comparison to the other line, a couple of things that you'll see here is that for LIHEAP and SIP customers, in all of the categories except for multifamily, they exceed the average kWh per square foot. But it also shows you that when you look at single family versus multifamily and owner versus renter, LIHEAP and SIP customers, they are using more per square foot in comparison to the other income brackets or classifications. What that learning shows us is that through the collaborative, not only are these customers having limited resources when it comes to income or financial resources, how they're using electricity from a standpoint is more per square foot in comparison to other customers that are in different income brackets. The next graph will show the information around electric burden. So purple line shows that the average customer's electric burden for our customers included in this analysis was 3.5%. As Will just described earlier, that right there is saying on average, they're using 3.5% of their income to pay their electric bill. Well, when you look at LIHEAP customers, when you look at LIHEAP and SIP customers, when you look at customers that are 150% below 150% of federal poverty guidelines, or those customers that are 150% to 200% of federal poverty guidelines, what is consistent is all groups of those customers in those income categories are using more than the 3.5%. Once again, an opportunity that shows that these customers are using more electricity in comparison to those customers who are above 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. These are just two of the data points that we looked at to understand, what customers are having the most challenges with affordability, and also helping us understand where there are some opportunities that we can lean in with solutions to make sure that the data is driving the areas of focus. All right. All right, and then the final slide, and I'll sum this up quickly. I know we have other students speak, but the final slide talks about how we've talked about it as from a low-income affordability ecosystem. We recognize that there are short-term benefits to address, short-term things that customers and challenges in their long-term, and then there's a core of kind of how we are making sure that we're available to help our customers with these solutions. So from a short-term standpoint, we really talk about bill pay assistance. There are a number of things that we do today through funding to local agencies, through the Duke Energy Foundation to provide bill pay assistance. And so those are things that are really helping avoid potentially disconnect non-pay and also arrears. I will also share, though, that as part of the Low Income Collaborative, we also came up with a recommendation that collaborative members generally supported that Duke Energy Progress recently included in our rate case that we filed in October, which is a bill pay assistance program that we call Customer Assistance Program, CAP is the acronym. And this right here is a proposal for LIHEAP and SIP customers, mainly for some of the very reasons I talked about earlier. They're experiencing some of the most significant affordability challenges. And so with that, what we're proposing in the rate case is that customers who receive LIHEAP and SIP would be eligible for a bill discount. The bill discount is $42 per month for a 12-month period. And so we're going through the regulatory process now to see, through our rate case, if that gets approval. And then that would be an ongoing partnership that we would have with DHHS, building upon some of the partnership we've had with them today. The other thing really is around long-term benefits. And this right here is, what are we doing to address energy intensity and electric burden? And that right there, we believe the core of that is energy efficiency. We have a suite of energy efficiency programs that we offer right now to North Carolina low-income customers or income-qualified customers. There have been some new programs that we have proposed more recently in front of the commission. But these are programs that are really designed to address customers that are using more of our product in comparison to other customers. And we believe energy efficiency is the key to that. I will share, like from an energy intensity standpoint, some of the data shows that customers that are LIHEAP and SIP recipients, their energy intensity in the winter is 100% more than those who are non-low income and 40% more in the summer. We believe a lot of that has to do around efficiency opportunities. And so those are how we are summing up, like where we're starting as it relates to solutions to drive benefits, both short-term and long-term. And then Payment Navigator is making sure that as customers call into our call center, we would have call center reps that are identified specifically to ensure that customers understand the solutions that I've talked about and additional products and services that we are looking at to address affordability for for these customers. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Cyrus.
Thank you so much, Kenisha. Really appreciate your account of the great work that Duke, the public staff, and all the stakeholders did as part of the Low-Income Affordability Collaborative. So we've heard from Will about kind of the basics of energy insecurity and how it manifests in the region. We've just heard from Kenisha about a process that one utility and its stakeholders went through to address these issues. And now we're going to hear from Alice Napoleon of Synapse about a framework for thinking about equity in the context of utility resource planning. So something that's a little more systematic and can be repeatable. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Alice to talk us through distributional equity in the NSPM.
Thank you, Cyrus. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and your slides are showing.
Great. Hi, everyone. So glad to be here with you today. My name is Alice Napoleon. I am a principal at Synapse Energy Economics, and I'm going to talk to you about the developments in terms of to develop a framework for addressing cost effectiveness and distributional equity. So just briefly, here's a little outline of our discussion today. I do want to note that in order to have equitable program outcomes, you need to consider the distribution and also equity in terms of, along with benefit cost analysis in energy decision making. Benefit cost analysis is a tool that assesses program cost effectiveness. It is widely used by many jurisdictions to inform decisions about utility investments, including investments in distributed energy resources, so DERs, which I'll use throughout the presentation today, that acronym. However, it's not able to effectively address equity on its own. To address limitations and the growing call for incorporating equity into decision-making, we developed a conceptual framework that pairs BCA, so benefit cost analysis, with a complementary distributional equity analysis. DEA, or the distributional equity analysis, is conducted alongside of BCA and can provide insight into the distribution of ratepayer-funded DER programs. Today, I'll be discussing DEA and what BCA and DEA are, how they differ, and potential outcomes and challenges of this framework. Just briefly about the National Energy Screening Project. It's a stakeholder organization run principally by E for the Future in coordination with other stakeholders. And you can see a few of the main products to date, which includes the National Standard Practice Manual for DERs, which is like the key work products to date, the methods, tools, and resources, which provides more granularity and detailed information about developing or modifying your existing primary cost effectiveness test using a set of fundamental BCA principles. And also the database of screening practices, which looks at it's an open source database. It looks at different tests and testing parameters that are used in different jurisdictions for ratepayer funded energy efficiency programs. So at the outset, I want to note that there are a number of different definitions for energy equity. This one here is from Pacific Northwest National Lab. We like it, and I want to note a couple things about it. One, it defines energy equity in terms of who has access to and who receives the benefits to economic, health, and social benefits of participation in programs. And it also requires that that you build consideration for the distribution of benefits into energy decision making. To achieve energy equity, jurisdictions must consider 3 dimensions that comprise energy equity. And I note that there are a couple of different frameworks for breaking equity out, and you can more or less combine some of these into, or split some of these out and to get the same definitions. But for my purposes right now, we're going to talk about the structural equity, which looks at the historical and cultural and institutional dynamics and structures that have exacerbated energy inequities. There's a few metrics that we mention here, including customer protections, data access and transparency, and community wealth building. For the procedural equity, that it focuses on ensuring inclusive, accessible, authentic engagement and representation when developing and implementing programs. And so along with that, you've got some metrics such as language access, compensation for engagement, things that make it easier for communities to participate. And distributional equity, which looks at how benefits are distributed across all segments of the community and across generations. That's important to note as well. And here we've got some metrics that consider energy burden, which you've heard about from our other speakers, air quality, things like economic development and participation, and related metrics. And I should note that these are just an example of some of the metrics that you should consider. All of the things that we heard earlier from Cyrus and Kanitcha should really are really worthy of consideration. We're going to focus on the distributional equity portion for our project, which I am going to describe a little bit later. So just a little bit about what cost-benefit analysis is and how it's conducted. So we have a better platform for understanding, or basis of understanding, of why benefit cost analysis, BCA, is not very well suited to considering equity aspects. Nearly every jurisdiction in the US uses BCA to assess cost effectiveness of ratepayer funded DER programs and to make decisions about resource investments. They compare the net present value, or NPV, of the DER's benefits with its costs, generally over the lifetime of that, and it creates a cost benefit ratio. So in general, the DER is considered cost effective if the benefit cost ratio is equal to or greater than 1. Or if it's less than that, it's not deemed to be cost effective. BCAs are designed to measure benefits and costs on average across the utility system. DER impacts, like avoided costs, are typically a blend of impacts experienced by all customers or by broad customer groups. Such might include all society, it might include just the ratepayers, it might include participants, for example. But in that context, it's very difficult or impossible to make a distinction for narrower customer groups, and such as the ones that were discussed in the other presentations today. Benefit cost analysis is not designed to evaluate equity impacts. Practices to date have not considered equity, energy equity with any with a lot of rigor. It's an emerging field. We're glad to see that a lot more attention is being paid to this. But BCAs do not directly address structural or procedural equity. Those are the ones that I mentioned earlier about institutional barriers and access to participation or participating in decision-making processes and ability to provide feedback. Additionally, BCAs do not and should not account for rate, bill, and participation impacts. Some jurisdictions use the ratepayer impact measure test in their BCA, which is, this test combines two analyses, one that really looks at the benefits and costs of investment, and the other that looks at rate impacts. And it really makes it very difficult to interpret and to answer. It doesn't really answer either question effectively. So the results are not intuitive to interpret. Distributional equity requires an understanding of which customers experience the costs and benefits of DER programs. And BCA is an inadequate tool for addressing distributional equity, as BCA cannot distinguish the impacts to larger populations. So I'm going to have to fly through some of these so that we can get through them. Let's see. So BCA is not able to break out impacts by groups. There have been some efforts in certain states to modify the BCA methodology in order to account for benefits and costs to specific populations, for example, by using an alternative threshold. So generally 1.0 is considered cost effective, but some jurisdictions have modified the threshold for certain programs. For example, low income energy efficiency. In some states, they consider a different threshold like 0.75. There are also other impacts that can be considered. So societal impacts, considering public health and economic development, as well as things like non-energy impacts to participants, which might include things like reduced absences from school or work, or improved productivity, which can happen as a result of commercial energy efficiency programs. And then lastly, discount rates, which place a higher value on longer term benefits and can really account for the equity across generations. Some jurisdictions supplement their BCAs with rate, bill, and participation impact analyses. These analyze the impact of the program on rates and bills between participants and non-participants. And it does provide some insight into the distributional equity of the program, but it only considers participants and non-participants only. I'm not going to be able to really cover this, but this is just an example of Massachusetts, which has a energy equity policy and or goal, and defines environmental justice neighborhoods by a number of different criteria. These are generally that we hold that the jurisdiction should define the target population, which is the population who is of concern. So this slide really is just going to, we're not starting from zero. There's a lot of literature and good studies that we're building on. However, you know, there are a number of additional things that need to happen here. So basically, I'm sorry, I was moving on to a different idea, just trying to be really fast and not really succeeding. Sorry about that. So distributional metrics are still needed. Example distributional equity metrics. Here's some examples: impacts on rates, bills, and participation. Energy burden we heard referenced earlier, as well as reliability and resilience and public health, which might include things like asthma and emergency room visits. These metrics, as with the target population, these metrics should be determined by each state based on their distributional equity, energy equity. So I think I've already pretty much covered that. So let's skip that. And I think this is, I just want to note for this table, this is a comparison of benefit cost analysis and distributional equity analysis. And these are looking at BCA as it's traditionally performed. One of the things that we're going to be considering in a project that I'll tell you about in a minute is how these things should be considered together. Okay, so I'm going to go really fast here and okay. Given the time, I'm not going to be able to really talk about these, but here are some steps into conducting a distributional equity analysis, which I've already alluded to: defining the target population and the equity metrics, mapping the data to the target population, and analyzing the metrics to determine the program impact, and then presenting the results of the BCA and the DEA together. So this is still a conceptual framework, and there's a lot that I'm glossing over right here in terms of access to information and energy data, and how these pieces will fit together. And unfortunately, I don't have any time to go through this. Apologies, but it's just more looking at how this hypothetical example, looking at how the results of a otherwise cost-effective program, so you can see there's a 1.5 there for the benefit cost ratio, might not have the optimal impact in terms of equity. And so this is just a hypothetical example, but it shows some of the things that we are likely to consider in our upcoming projects. Okay, and DEA challenges, as I alluded to before, that there are few examples in the industry of DEA methods being used. Data access is certainly an issue, as we alluded to in Ms. Barnes' presentation. And using DEA results in decision-making is somewhat has not been specifically tied in other places. And DEA and BCA can provide conflicting results. And so there needs to be some policy and judgment involved. Oops. And the most important one at all, that slide of all, which I really didn't leave much time for. So the National Energy Screening Project and Berkeley National Lab are partnering to develop a guidance document on DEA. It's jointly funded by the DOE and Future. And this team includes who will be developing this: LBNL, E for the Future, and my company, Synapse Energy Economics. And it will build on the conceptual framework DEA framework described in the Methods, Tools, and Resources Handbook. The project will focus on benefit cost analysis and decision-making for utility investments, research the current state of equity metrics and measurement, develop a how-to guide on conducting DEA, and it should be applicable to any jurisdiction. Includes a variety of target audiences, it builds on existing energy initiatives and frameworks, and presents a real-world case study application. We have an advisory group that we have convened. The timeline for this is now through the fourth quarter of 2023 and beyond. And really excited to present this and to collaborate on this work. And thank you and apologies for not leaving time for questions.
Alice, that's quite all right. There's clearly a lot of great information to share here, and this is not the last time we'll talk about this issue. So let me ask this as kind of a catch-all closing question for you. For folks who are interested in following the progress of this project, is there a way for outside parties to get information or updates about that? And I know Julie Michaels and Natalie from E for the Future are already also on. So if either of them want to answer that question, or if you have that answer, that'd be great. If not, we can follow up in our follow-up materials.
I think we definitely want to follow up in our follow-up materials. I do note that we are going to be making presentations and providing updates, certainly as we finish up the project, but I imagine we'll probably making them along the way as well. I believe that there is going to be a landing page, and so subject to check with Julie. I don't think that that's been launched quite yet, but yes, we will send some more information so you can stay in touch. And I think also there's the NESP newsletter, which I'm guessing will have a lot of great information on this.
Thanks so much. Julie, Natalie, I see you popped on. Do you want to add anything?
This is Julie Michaels. I would just add that LB&L will be creating a web page for this project at some point, and we will be sure to post that with as part of our newsletters, and otherwise the NESP also has an energy equity webpage where we will link to that. So there's a way for folks to access progress and updates on that work.
Wonderful. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to wrap there. We've dropped a feedback link into the chat. We'll also send it in our follow-up materials. Sorry, we couldn't leave a little more time for questions, but we will try to look at those that have been submitted and get the questioners' answers as appropriate. But thank you so much for joining us today. Clearly, a lot of exciting developments around equity in 2023 coming. Stay tuned to SIA, stay tuned to E for the Future and Synapse for more updates based on what you've heard today. And join me in thanking all of our speakers, Will Bryan, Kanitsha Barnes, and Alice Napoleon for their time today. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.